when you go back and read your earlier writing, I look at a very early version of my first novel that I wrote, and I still have the very first version, and it's leaves a lot to be desired. But at the time, I thought I was a great writer, and I was breaking all the rules, and the writing was very poor. But it was my first, my first crack at creative writing. And I guess when you look at how far you've come, that's a sign that you can say, yeah, look, we always think that we're doing well now, but we are always improving. And when you look back and look at your old stuff and see just how far you've come, I think that kind of validates that, yeah, I'm starting to get this now. I'm starting to understand, and you get that advice and you improve through feedback, working with editors, and it's a continual journey of improvement.
Yeah, for sure. And it's been helpful for me to read other people's work and give them feedback too. That's been just as helpful as anything, because I mean, we all know it's just easier to see things in other people's writing, even things you're doing in your own writing, so it's just a helpful reminder that it's all a process, and to,
I think the one of the biggest things of transitioning from scientific writing is that trying to remove the passive voice from all your writing, because scientific writing, you're not supposed to write as first person or third person or whatever. It's all passive voice constantly, and so yeah, that was a bit of a culture change when you've come into the creative writing, is you're flipping that on its head and removing all of that and actually having to characterize and put the characters in, because it's a big difference.
The characters, you're right, such a big difference, and sort of getting emotional engagement in the reader. That would probably the biggest hill I had to climb. And that's still very difficult for me. That's still something I really have to work on. It's layer and layer and layer.
Yeah,
for sure.
And that's a good segue to the next question I want to ask, in terms of, so you're writing fiction stories, and in your case, you have environmental eco themes, whether it be climate change or resource extraction, pollution. So your environmental themes, I guess, are your sort of underlying key message. But how do you balance that in a way that you're not coming across as preachy or lecturing your readers about issues? And the reason why I asked that question is, I remember a while ago I read a book, and it was a novel about a particular environmental issue, but it was really laid on thick, and I really felt that I was being lectured to by the author. It was the author's voice coming through rather than the voice of the characters. So what are your thoughts on how do you do that well, so that perhaps there might be subtleties in the way you are delivering your key message, but as you said, you're telling the story through your characters. It's about your characters rather than you embarking on your crusade as an author to tell the reader about all the bad things that happen in the world. How do you kind of balance that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I totally agree that it doesn't work. I don't think it works if you have a crusade, really. And, I write the stories that I'm writing because I don't understand the answer. And so in some ways it's an exploration to kind of see what I really think about that. And again, I'm not necessarily after what's the environmental answer to this? It's really about these characters and what is going to be the right, what's the right thing for them in the end, kind of, for whatever issue it is. So or certainly early on, when I was just really had that technical writer background, I probably did get too sciencey or whatever in my writing. So I've learned to really start with the characters and really start with their story. And both my books, my novels, are really a kind of a family drama more than anything. And so it's really about these families and what they're going through, and the environmental issues, kind of this wrinkle that they're sort of having to deal with. So hopefully that
early on, I often went into the sort of lecture mode, because obviously you're trying to, my books focus around a paramedic, and you're trying to inform people about what the paramedics are doing and this, that, and the other. And
sure.
I'd end up getting into these sort of lectures, sort of a big paragraph or a few paragraphs of lectures. So I rely heavily on my beta readers to point out it's just like not interested. This bit can be deleted. You know, it's not necessary. And over time, I've sort of managed to hone that down because, yeah, you do get tempted to sort of want to sort of preach that sort of knowledge or whatever, but then sometimes it just becomes an info dump.
And I think I've been guilty of the same thing, and probably similarities with you and I, Harry. You know, I used to go on a bit of a tirade about things that were frustrating me, whether it be the court system and lenient penalties for criminals, or internal political issues. You know, so again, conveying that message through the voice of your character rather than it being the narrative of you as the author.
Yeah.
Yeah, because all those things can be really interesting too, like those particular professional details can be also really great for a story. But yeah, it takes a little bit.
You're going to drip feed them in.
Yes.
Now, with your books, Kate, my question is, how do you define or how do you categorize the genre where your books sit in? Are there some crossover with whether it be mystery or romance or suspense? Where do your books sit in terms of if they're on the bookshelves in a bookstore, what genre or what category would they be, or do you feel that you are a bit of a crossover?
I think that my books definitely cross over, and I think it's made it maybe a little bit complicated in terms of publication because they don't necessarily are defined in a particular way. My new book coming out called Stone Creek is defined as a thriller, but I would say it's maybe more thrilling than thriller in the traditional sense. There's definitely a romantic aspect. There's a coming of age kind of story. So it's a blend for sure. And one reviewer even said that it was kind of hard to define. And I think, and they were positive about the book. I mean, that sounds maybe like, but they were positive about it, but it is, I think in some ways, it doesn't fit a particular slot. And I think my first book probably didn't really either so much. But yeah,
makes it really difficult to sell and publish us and stuff like that if you don't know where it fits in the whole sort of bookshelf and the like.
Exactly.
It's the same for me because my short stories that I do are effectively dark humored paramedic procedurals. So I just made up my own genre for it because it didn't exist.
I do think that maybe there's a little more openness to these sorts of like blend stories lately. Maybe I feel like I see a little bit more of that out there. So I think it'd be nice because I think it's original and creative, kind of writing. I'm not saying mine is, but I'm just saying I think it's nice when we can blend these things together without feeling like you have to write to a certain sort of formula or whatever.
Yeah.
And how would you describe, Kate, either the similarities or differences between your two books?
Well, my books are, they definitely deal with, for one thing, small towns. I definitely write about rural places. I've kind of always lived in rural places, so I know that world, like the small town. I can't really foresee myself writing about a city life so much just because I don't know that very well. And they both, deal with an environmental kind of problem. And I would say they're both kind of family dramas. I tend to like to look at the family unit facing some, dysfunction or fractured in some way and how they try to resolve these things. So I'd say those are the similarities.
And so I'm assuming so they're standalone books. There's no direct correlation between the characters or the storylines between the two books.
No, and I can't foresee myself ever writing a series. I feel like once I write my story and I've been with those characters for years and years, I'm ready to move on to someone else. So yeah.
I have to admit, my level of researching was I looked at where you were because I needed to know where you were in the world and where is it, Riegelsville or How did you pronounce it again?
It's called Riegelsville.
Riegelsville. And
Yeah.
you know, sort of me being my usual self of being distracted with things very easily. It's right next to Allentown, or near Allentown, which is the song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I presume that's the one from the song. And
Yes,
did they shut all the factories down?
Yes, they really did shut them all down. And
Right,
in
okay.
fact, it's the old building that was, you know, the steel mill at the time, stood empty for years and years and years, but now it's been converted to a casino. So, yeah. So that is what happened to that industry.
Paid for by Billy Joel.
I don't think so, not in this case, but I don't know if he's ever been back.
Yeah, perhaps
You know,
not.
it's funny. I teach a class right now about like the local area, and we look at Bethlehem Steel, which is actually the subject of Billy Joel's song.
Right.
You're living here in Allentown, but the steel operation was actually in the next town over in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And my students who are, you know, 18, 19, 20, I actually bring that song into the class, you know, because it's really about like the local area, and they have no idea what it is. They have never heard of it.
Yeah, I find that I'll make some comments because, you know, I'm working with most paramedics now are in their early 20s because of the way they bring them in. Everyone has to go to uni these days. And so, yeah, I'll be making sort of comments, and I'll just get this blank look, and I'll go, you have no idea what I'm talking about, do you?
Yeah, the first time I brought that song in, because I felt like that's a song, at least in the United
Everyone
States,
should know it.
everybody knows the song. But no, they had no idea about it. And then I tried to show them the video, which is, you know, way back, and it's just like kind of ridiculous in today's world, you know. But anyway.
Yeah.
It's funny. I'm currently editing a new manuscript, and there was a scene there where I talk about the generational gap between this streetwise copper working with a junior female officer, and he makes a reference to Benny Hill, the English comedian, and she goes, Benny who? He makes a reference, you know, you can't assume anything because it'll make an ass out of you or me, and she just looks at him, and he said, never mind, you know. And
don't
so
worry.
yeah, maybe that's just, you know, that's just me telling the reader my age, and you know. Having a bit of fun with the generational gap as well in the story. Now, I just wanted to jump into something you touched on before, Kate. You talked about writing in rural settings. And another point I wanted to delve into is about how you write with a sense of place. Can you talk us through that? Harry and I have discussed this before in other podcasts around how do you use your setting as almost like a character in your story, and rather than it just being a bit piecemeal or tokenistic, how can you really weave the setting into your story and you're continually drip feeding that in? Do you have any sort of tips, particularly for any writers who are listening to this? What would be sort of your advice on how can you really maximize that sense of place in your writing?
Well, I don't know that I have advice necessarily. I mean, I think for me, I'm just super kind of obsessed with place in terms of like where I've lived. I really know like I'm somebody who can go out in the woods and like name the plants, and I know something about the trees, and I can say something about the birds, because I'm just really interested. And the rocks, exactly. So I'm just really interested in the landscape, and I've always been interested in the landscape around me, and interested in the people that came before and why a place looks like it does, kind of the history and the culture of the place. Just naturally, I'm just interested in that. So I can't write a story without kind of representing in some ways like the history before, and why it looks like it is, and what makes people, the community, what makes them. I do believe that people, you know, every community is kind of the way it is definitely related to the landscape that they're in. So it's just a natural thing for me to do. I don't know that, you know, not everybody has that sort of interest, and, you know, other people write something else and bring something else in maybe that I wouldn't necessarily, but I really, I do work a lot on the setting, and the setting is definitely related to my story. You know, like the idea of small towns and communities and everybody knows everyone. That's definitely a big thing in both of my novels. So yeah.
I'd also like to delve into we touched on your scientific side and your creative side, and we spoke about this off air about your painting. Can you talk us through in terms of the similarities of the creative process between writing and painting?
Yeah. So I just dabble in painting. Like I'm not particularly good or anything, but I actually like to paint just so I can complete something creatively when I'm writing a novel, because it just takes so long to write a novel, but I can, finish a painting in a day, and it just feels like, okay, I did something. I finished something. So in part, I just like it for that aspect, but I have, seen sort of overlap between the creative process. Like for instance, in a painting, typically there's, a focal point that the painter is trying to get you to look at. And there are ways in which you can construct a painting with like leading lines and things to get the viewer to look at that focal point. And, maybe the most successful paintings have this sort of, they're created and composed so that you're looking at this focal point. And I think that's very true with writing, like you kind of, we all know we start overly complicating sometimes our stories, and that you really have to work to figure out, well, what is this really about and what's the focus? And you kind of have to peel away a lot of things in order to sort of let that emerge. And so I think that that's one relationship. The other thing I would say is that, I this is just maybe my preference, but I tend to like a very minimalistic painting. So I like, there's probably a lot of white. I do watercolor, so it's white paper, and there's probably a lot of maybe white still on the paper, and I think that can bring a lot to the painting in some ways. It's simple, but I also think that it's I guess maybe the way I would say it is sometimes what you leave out of the painting is just as important than what you have in, right? And so I also think this is true on the page in a story. Many times what the characters don't say is tells more of a story than what they are saying in a conversation or when they're in a room. So those are the kinds of things that occur to me as I'm painting sometimes, that there's these similarities. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting analogy. Yeah, I like that. Sometimes less is more. What's not on the page or what's not on the canvas could be just as important as what's there. And also, I think you talk yourself down. Your painting, from what I can see, is really, really beautiful watercolors. And I had a look at your website, even to the point that it's now one of your paintings is the cover of your new book, Stone Creek. Is that right?
Yeah. That was my publisher just thought that would be a good idea. And I mean, I'm very pleased, and I like it a lot. I think it's I paint my local area. So I'm writing my new book, Stone Creek, is the story is nothing to do with the town that I live in, but the setting is very much based in where I live. And so the painting then, is where I live. And so it feels right. It feels like the right cover for the book.
Yeah.
Did the publisher pay you for the for the painting?
No.
No. Yeah.
No.
So just to clarify, so your stories, are they set in fictional towns?
Yeah, they're fictional.
So how have you found that balance between, as you say, you're inspired by your local area? And I was the same with one of my first crime stories. It was a fictional town, but resembled, or I was inspired from an actual regional town that I was stationed at and worked at for 11 years. And people that know me will say, well, you were writing about this particular town. But I said, oh, no, it's a fictional town. How do you kind of balance that where people will say, look, you've described things maybe inadvertently, but are quite clearly drawn from an actual real town? And does that cause any problems for you at all? Or there's been no problems with the use of your own ideas inspired by a real town, even though it's coming across as a fictional town?
Yeah. I can't answer that question yet because my first novel really was a fictional town. Like I didn't base it but the new novel is definitely like readers of my hometown will recognize things. And I am a little bit, I mean the story is good, and you know, for like the characters in the story have nothing to do with my town. But I am a little bit like, how will this go over? I don't know how it will go over, and I'm a little bit you know, not worried, but just I'm curious to see what happens.
And I guess the same question could be about the characters. And would people say, "Oh, you're writing about such and such because maybe there's a particular quirky personality or characters"? How do you do that? Do you
Yeah.
find that your characters are a blend of real people that you've met?
Well, my characters are definitely a blend of real people that I've met, but I think maybe my concerns about, you know, basing the story setting on my home place is probably more related to thinking that people will then think that the characters in the story are about people in this town. And I mean, that's not the case. But I think that's probably what I'm a little bit more worried about, you know, that they might connect the two somehow.
Yeah, yeah.
Obviously, you know, both Jack and I, we have to be very careful with characters on the grounds that, you know,
Sure.
certainly from my side of things with you know, patients, I'm writing about patients, but I can't obviously base them on any real person. Some people will jump to conclusions that, oh, I recognize those attributes, but you know, I'm very careful at making sure that there's no chance that somebody's going to recognize themselves or whatever, unless they've asked me to write them in as a character, which has happened.
Yeah. Well,
and you go, all right, whatever, you'll use you.
Yeah. Well,
So sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for.
yeah.
And I guess with Harry and I, with Harry's protagonist is a paramedic and mine's a police detective, and you know those suggestions of, you know, how much of yourself have you put into your protagonist? What about for you, Kate? Are there any protagonists that could resemble you or your voice?
I mean, I think all of our characters, our main characters anyway, are little pieces of us, right? In some ways. So I wouldn't say that I'm like that my protagonists are me by any means, no. But I think, yeah, they're, you know, they're parts of us.
Yes, most definitely. Now, just before we will start to wrap up, but I'm very keen to ask you about your role as a director or co-director of the Moravian Writers Conference, which I understand is an annual writers conference. Can you tell us, how did you first become involved in that, and then tell us a little bit more about the conference?
Yeah, this is a writers conference that takes place at where I teach at Moravian University, and it's been going on for quite a few years. This was actually the 10-year anniversary just this past March. And it was not, I've not been involved for that long. I've just been involved in the last few years. And I became involved. I got to know I teach geology primarily, but I got to know the creative writer at Moravian who started the conference, and we decided to work together. And that's how I got involved. And we used to have, you know, topically, we used to have sort of pick a theme every year. And we've done various themes, probably more like on the social justice side of things. But most recently, we've kind of decided to refocus the conference slightly to focus on this idea of story and how story is used in everyday life, so that the conference felt more open. So, you know, people who maybe aren't writers, but they have something to say, maybe they want to do, you know, this kind of thing, like podcasts, and share stories in that way, that they could feel welcome, and that we could have, like, we decided to try to like open up our programming a little bit more to include these different formats of storytelling. And I think we'll continue with that because it feels like, you know, more people are engaged in that way. I think, and, you know, like, for instance, one of the panels that we had at the last conference was how professionals use storytelling. So we had a minister, we had a lawyer, And we had somebody who does work with veterans. And that was really powerful, you know, and they weren't professional storytellers. They were just simply talking about how story is used in their professions and how it, you know, helps connect with people and helps them communicate, really. So that was really interesting.
And the advice that you give in the various topics during a conference, can it be applied to people who are writing fiction, non-fiction, memoirs? Is it quite broad, or is there a particular focus on any type of writing?
I think it's a, you know, I think with our new sort of thinking about storytelling, it is actually quite broad. You know, I think, you know, I haven't written that much nonfiction, but, you know, I've read some nonfiction, and I feel like the best tells a story, you know, so I really think this idea of storytelling is so powerful, you know, across many genres, really.
And I'll just see some of the points, some of the themes of the conference. For example, I've just got a few notes here, things including, and you've sort of touched on these. What is the value of writing in our society today? Can we use it as a tool to promote social justice and peace, which you spoke about? And what professions draw on storytelling skills? And that's something we've also talked about as well. And can we use story sharing to make connections to our own histories and each other? So there's some really some quite interesting and topical themes and topics that you cover there at the conference.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that we'll continue to kind of develop that conference and offer content that's very related to what you just shared. Yeah.
And is the conference, it's a face-to-face conference? Is it sort of cater more for local people? Do you have people traveling to attend, or are there, what's the overall structure of the conference? Are there online components? How does it work?
It has, we have had both online and in-person components. For, like, during COVID, we were completely online, and we had, you know, I think a more sort of national, even some international people attending in that way. We have offered a bit less of the online component, and but we still have been offering that. But yeah, mostly it's local people coming in, and of course the students. You know, we're trying to get the students to come at the university too.
Okay, and you've just completed the most recent conference in March this year. So are you already starting to plan for next year's conference?
We do, yeah. We start planning right after the conference ends. We start planning. So, but the planning and the most of the work will begin in the fall. In earnest. You know, we're working really hard. Right now we're taking a little break.
And is Moravian University, what city is it in, or is it
it's in Bethlehem.
Bethlehem,
so
right, okay.
The same as Bethlehem Steel, the Billy Joel song.
Yeah.
Same city.
Right,
yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, well, fantastic.
I didn't think that the little rural town would have a university that was.
Yeah, no. My town only has one traffic light. There's nothing. Yeah. It's very small.
Cool.
Yeah.
So clearly you're a very, very busy person, Kate, with your involvement in the conference and your own personal writing plus your own professional career. So what's planned now in the near future in terms of, so you've got your new book coming out in August, Stone Creek, in terms of what's planned for the launch, and where are your energies currently?
Well, all of my energies right now are definitely in the launch phase. So yeah, for the next, you know, couple months, I have a lot, you know, book events and other things. And yes, that's what I'm doing until the fall, when my teaching starts, and then I'll have to put that aside and do my paying job. And that's when that will start, and I'll do that for a while. So yeah.
Are you going to go for book 3?
Yes, I've already started book 3.
Excellent.
Yes. Yeah, for me, it's a long journey, you know,
Yes.
so looking at multiple years, but it's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
Have you given yourself a deadline for when you'd like to have book 3 finished and published?
About 7 years?
It'll be probably about 7 years. Yeah, I haven't deadline. At this point, all I aspire to do is write, you know, 30 minutes a day. So
Right.
that's what I do. That's all. At some point my deadlines will change, you know, I'll word counts or, you know, whatever. But for now, it's just 30 minutes a day.
Cool.
And it just goes to show the incredible patience writers have to have, you know, to play that incredibly long game, to be committed to something for so long. You really need to have your heart set on it and be passionate about it, don't you, in order to be able to maintain that for such a long period.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Well, Kate Branders, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I'd like to wish you all the best with your writing career and your professional career, and particularly with your the launch of your new book, Stone Creek. We'll be sure to share your website and other details on our channels as well. So, for me personally, thank you so much for your time, and I'd like to wish you all the best.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for having me and for spending this time, and I really appreciate it. It's been really a fun conversation.